morning, my fellow treasure hunters and explorers. This morning I'm going to continue our reading of Lost Treasures on the Old Spanish Trail by George A. Thompson. This is chapter 4, In Search of Cibola. From the time of Columbus, the Spaniards' first interest was always gold. Father Perez de Ribas, Padre Provincial of New Spain, made that quite clear in his writings. The first motive of the entry of Spaniards into the Sierra was to search for silver, many rich deposits soon being found. The Sierras extend north from the city of Guadalajara for 300 leagues or more, far into New Mexico. But they would never have been explored had there not existed the ever-tantalizing hope of discovering vast riches, the hope which draws men irresistibly even from across the reaches of the unknown seas. The discovery of those riches is most satisfying to the king. Among the first to follow de Vaca's trail north were John de Ascension and Fray Pedro Nadal. Poorly equipped, they never ventured far. Nevertheless, they pushed a trail a little further into the unknown and returned with trails that the Indians they met wore cotton clothing and owned great quantities of turquoise. In November of 1538, Viceroy Mendoza himself directed Father Marcos de Niza, an Italian Franciscan, to investigate de Vaca's story. The Viceroy instructed Father Marcos to take samples of precious metals and gemstones to compare with those the Indians might have, telling him to bring back samples of everything precious so that His Majesty might fully be informed. How Father Marcos ever became ordained as a man of God remains somewhat of a mystery, for he proved to be one of the greatest liars of all time. Father Marcos began his journey to Cibola on March 7, 1539, with the giant Negro Esteban as his guide. The story of how Esteban was killed by Indians at Zuni Pueblo and how Father Marcos saw the pueblo only from a distance need not be repeated at length. Only the reports he brought back to Viceroy Mendoza concerns us now. Father Marcos returned to Culiacan on September 2, 1539, and gave a report entirely fabricated from his fertile imagination. When I showed the natives the samples of gold I had taken with me, they said there were vessels of it among their people, and that they wore round ornaments of it hanging from their noses and ears, and also that they have blades of gold with which they scrape the sweat from their bodies. Many of the people I saw there wore silk clothing down to their feet. Of the richness of that country I cannot write, because it is so great it does not seem possible. They have temples of metal covered with precious stones, I think emeralds. They use vessels of gold and silver because they have no other metal. So great was the excitement caused by the report of Father Marcos that Culiacan was deserted almost overnight. Expeditions not authorized by Viceroy Mendoza were illegal. Nevertheless, almost every able-bodied man joined the rush to the new El Dorado. Melchior Diaz, with a party of 15 men, was one of the first to leave. It is now known that Diaz traveled north as far as the Tizon, which is the Colorado River, to a place not described precisely but thought to be along that section now known as the Grand Canyon. But the Diaz party and many others whose identities were never known or recorded have been overshadowed by the greatest journey of the exploration the West ever witnessed, that of Francisco Coronado. There was never a conquest like that of Coronado in the history of the world. In less than a decade, he conquered more new territory for Spain than the Roman Empire acquired in 5 centuries. Since Coronado's saga opened up the American West and gave birth to countless tales of treasure and lost mines, it is pertinent to describe in some detail here. On January 6, 1540, Francisco Vasquez de Coronado, governor of Nueva Galicia, was commissioned by King Charles I as Captain General of the Indies, with specific instructions to find and explore the land of Cibola. Garcia Lopez de Cardenas was chosen as his maestro de campo, or second in command, while Don Pedro de Tovar was designated as ensign general. Pedro Castaneda was picked to be chronicler of the expedition. Father Marcos reluctantly accompanied the party, but only because he was ordered to do so. He knew there were no golden cities to be found, and he dreaded what might happen when only a few poor Zuni pueblos were discovered. He had a good reason to worry. Translation of Castaneda's journey differs slightly, but it is generally agreed that Coronado's army consisted of some 250 mounted men and 62 foot soldiers. Most were outfitted with the best available Castillian armor and swords. Including in the armament were 19 crossbows, 27 harbuscus firearms. Several hundred Indian slaves accompanied the army as servants and herdsmen for the approximately 1,000 cattle, sheep, and hogs driven along for food. The great expedition left the outpost town of Compostela on February 23, 1540. Following the already well-traveled Spanish trail northward, it had been used by Cabaza de Vaca, Father Marcos Diaz, and a host of other unknown frontiersmen who had joined the rush to Cibola, or to prospect for mines and hunt for slaves. Coronado would find Diaz along the Gila River in Arizona, and Diaz would accompany him on his quest to the north. Coronado's army slowly made its way north into Arizona, where it followed the Gila River to the northeast. The trail was easy to follow into the land of the Zuni Indians, where Esteban had been killed, and Father Marcos had seen the mud pueblos which he told Viceroy Mendoza were splendid cities. Instead of Cibola, Coronado found only a squalid huddle of stone and adobe tenement-like houses, looking as if they had all been crumpled up together. At Haku Pueblo, they were met by the same angry Indians who had killed Esteban. They threw heavy stones down on the Spaniards and fired flights of arrows at them. Coronado was struck by a heavy stone and was knocked senseless. His soldiers attacked and seized the pueblo, killing many Indians. They found nothing at Haku or any of the surrounding pueblos which even remotely resembled anything described by Father Marcos. Because of the great anger of the soldiers, Castaneda wrote, "When we first saw the villages that Father Marcos said was Cibola, such were the curses that were hurled at him that I pray God may protect him from them." Because Coronado feared for the priest's life, he sent him back to Mexico with a report to the Viceroy in which he wrote, "We are very distrustful of him, and I feel great anxiety and dismay to see that everything is just the opposite of what he has told your lordship." At Culiacan, Father Marcos fell into disgrace with the Viceroy and was reassigned to a desert vista in Huelap, where he died in poverty in 1558. Coronado's soldiers searched every pueblo at Cibola for treasure, but none was found. In the expedition journal, Castillian wrote, "Of gems, only 2 fragments of emeralds and some little brown stone which approach the color of poor garnet have been found. There is little turquoise, for most of it has been hidden. As for gold and silver, some very small pieces have been found, which those who know about minerals say is not bad. I have not been able to learn where they obtained it, for they refuse to tell the truth in anything." Apparently the soldiers tried every means to make the Indians tell where the tiny flakes of gold came from, and we can well imagine the methods that they used, for Castaneda continued, We have not yet managed to induce the Indians to tell, but I trust in God they will not be able to avoid answering much longer." The Indians insisted they had no gold, and anxious to be rid of the Spaniards, they told of rich lands further north, where gold was plentiful, to the west of Tisania and to the north of Quivira. Coronado quickly dispatched exploring parties to find these new lands. In his History of Utah, Hubert H. Bancroft wrote, "As Coronado was journeying to the north, he rested at Cibola, that is to say at Zuni, and while waiting for the main party of his army, he sent expeditions out in several directions. Pedro de Tovar, with 20 men, and attended by Fray Jean Padilla, proceeded northwest, and after 5 days reached Tusania, or the Moki villages, which were quickly captured. There they learned of a large river further north. While at Tusayan, sometime in July of 1540, the soldiers encountered a band of friendly Zunis with whom they learned of a rich province far to the northwest across deserts and mountains, where the people lived on the shore of a great lake and owned much gold and silver." And I think that this great lake was the once great lake of Copalla, which I think was drained with the continental uplift, and I think that lake, I don't think that lake existed anymore, and I think that was where the legend of Copalla and Cibola and all that stemmed from, was that once great Aztec area that was now destroyed by volcanic activity, the continental uplift, and the draining of the lake. Always there was the story that the mines were still further north, but now Coronado learned of another land even richer than Cibola, a land which would tantalize treasure hunters for the next century. It is the fabled land of Tuguano, far to the north by the shores of the Great Lake the Indians called Copalla. Okay, so they're talking about what I believe was at one time Lake Uinta, and I don't believe it in Lake Uinta, and this lake had disappeared sometime when the Aztec left it, when it was destroyed probably by continental uplift or volcanic activity, and so it no longer existed even though it had at one time. And I think that's why Coronado couldn't find it, is because it was gone. Even though it was shown on some of the old Castillian maps, some of the old maps that they had. Pedro de Tovar and his men returned to Haku on August 25, 1540, reporting that he had reached Tusano, a scenic land, but he brought back no gold. He also related that the Indians there had told him of a land of treasure far to the north at a place they called Tiguano. Immediately Coronado dispatched the Captain Cardenas with 25 men to locate that promised land. Pedro de Sotomayor went along as the expedition's chronicler. Cardenas was ordered to explore further north than de Tovar had. Coronado allowed him 80 days to go and return, to search for gold, not scenery. Historian Bancroft states that the Cardenas party were the first Europeans to enter what is now Utah. With an ample supply of provisions, Cardenas marched for 20 days through a desert country and until he discovered a large river. It was a branch of the river called Tizon, or the Colorado. It flowed to the southwest. In vain for days they sought to escape from the mountains and descend to the river, for they were suffering greatly from thirst. At length, 3 of the lightest and most active crept over the bank and descended into the canyon until they were out of sight. They did not return until evening, when they reported their failure to reach the river, saying that everything was much further away than it seemed from above. Rocks that looked no larger than a man were in fact higher than the great cathedral at Seville. Compelled by thirst, they were forced to return to Cibola, the Haku Pueblo. Bancroft cites records of the archives of the Indies at Seville, which reveal that Cardenas traveled north to the San Juan River in southern Utah, followed it downstream to the Tizon or Colorado. If Cardenas had traveled west beyond Tucson, Zuni, as some suppose, he would have crossed the Little Colorado River, which his chronicler Sotomayor does not mention. In fact, Sotomayor recorded they suffered greatly from thirst, something he would not have written had they reached the Little Colorado. Bancroft states that Cardenas viewed the Colorado at a place much nearer to its source than had Diaz. Although the Indians encountered belonged to the same nation as those Diaz had met, in the founding of Utah, author Levi Edgar Young concurs with Bancroft, also stating that Cardenas was the first European of record to enter present-day Utah. Of interest is the fact that several pieces of armor of the type used by Cardenas, but not used after 1600, were found in the Monument Valley area in 1952. Some believe that several of the Cardenas party explored even further north, crossing the San Juan and wintering somewhere in the land of Teguano. In his journals compiled from 1595 to 1645, a time when the facts were much cleaner than they are now, Jesuit Padre Perez de Ribas wrote, "They finally arrived at 40 degrees north latitude, where in the winter it was so cold that the rivers were frozen over. They crossed a country where the Indians passed their day hunting the cibolas, the buffalo. It is interesting to note that 40 degrees north latitude passed through what is now Utah Valley and Utah Lake, known in the 16th century as Lake Copala, in the land of Teguano. On his return to Haku, Cardenas found the Indians on the verge of revolt because of the abuses they had suffered and the large quantities of corn and other foodstuff which had been stolen from them. 200 of the Indians were captured, and because Coronado had ordered that they were not to be taken alive, but to be an example of them should be made so the other Indians would fear the Spaniards, Cardenas ordered that 200 stakes be prepared to burn them alive. When the Indians saw what was planned, they ran to escape. Our men attacked on all sides so that there was great confusion, and the horsemen gave chase to those who tried to escape. As the country was level, not a man of them remained alive, but several other Indians did flee during the night, so that news of the Spaniards' cruelty soon spread throughout the land. When the Indians of other villages learned of Coronado's obsession with gold and of his cruel treatment of their countrymen, they saw a means of getting rid of him, so that the Spaniards would not stop at their pueblos. Indians would tell Coronado that Cibola lay still further ahead, always somewhere else. Because Cardenas had been unable to cross the Tizon River in his quest for Teguano, when spring came, Coronado led his army to the northeast in search of Quivira. The Indians of Zuni were eager to tell him whatever he wanted to hear of the riches to be found there, so that they might be rid of him. Coronado was told that in Quivira there were great quantities of turquoise, and that objects of silver were commonplace. He was told that the people of Quivira lived by the sides of a great river, where fishes were as big as horses, and where the people used large canoes which carried great sails. Gold is so plentiful that the natives, not knowing of any other metal, make everything they need from it, even the tips of their arrows and lances. The chief of that land wears a copper plate over his breast and takes his afternoon nap under a great tree on which there hung many little golden bells. which lull him to sleep as they swing on the breeze. And to Coronado their tales seemed to be true, for hadn't Cabaza de Vaca returned with just such a bell? During April of 1541, Coronado started for Quivira, a land with gold, silver, and fabrics abundant and beautiful in everything. He passed by Manzano and Sandia mountains where he saw old mines of turquoise, but they appeared to be ancient, long unworked even then. In one village along the way, his soldiers found olas filled with a shiny metal used by the Indians in glazing their pottery, which is an indication that mines of silver can be found in that country. The shiny metal was probably mica or galena lead, pretty but of little value. All summer long the ragged army pushed further northeast in search of Quivira, lured on by tales told by the Indians anxious to have them pass through their country as quickly as possible. They crossed all of New Mexico, passed through northern Texas into Oklahoma, and continued far out onto the barren plains of Kansas. Castaneda recorded, "All there is at Quivira is a very brutish people without any decency whatsoever in their homes or anything." It was fortunate that Father Marcos had returned to Mexico, for the soldiers cursed him daily. With another bleak winter facing them and supplies running low, Coronado began the long journey back to Culiacan. To his king he wrote, "As far as I can judge, it does not appear to me that there is any hope of finding gold or silver, but I trust God that if there is any, we shall get our share of it, and it shall not escape us through any lack of diligence in the search." At Cibola, Zuni, 3 Franciscan priests asked permission to remain and establish a mission to instruct the Indians in the ways of Christianity. They were Fray Jean de Padilla, Fray Luis de Escanolia, and Fray John de la Cruz. Coronado's army was hardly out of sight before all 3 were killed by the Indians. 3 Indian guides were also remained behind: Andres of Culiacan, Gaspar of Mexico City, and Anton of Guadalajara. They were more fortunate, for when the Espejo expedition passed through Zuni more than 40 years later, all 3 were still alive and had families. Coronado was not as lucky as his guides, for on his return to Mexico he was arrested. He had opened a land as vast as any conquistador ever had, but he had found no gold. Too much money and too many lives had been spent for nothing. Although in time charges against him were dismissed, he died in disgrace and was buried in the walls of the church of Santiago Domingo at Mexico City. Cardenas fared no better, for he had brought back no gold either. He was arrested and banned from the New World and sentenced to exile in Spain. But the Coronado expedition had opened a whole new world where others would find treasure. Castaneda described the real value of the great Odyssey when he wrote, "Although they found not the gold for which they sought, better still, they found a place in which to search." And that's precisely why Coronado didn't find any gold, was because the gold was still in the mountains and still in the hills. Anything that had been mined in the past by the Aztec or any other groups of people had made its way to the Aztec city and were being used there in their rituals and in their decorations. And so I think that because the culture of the Aztec and the Inca and the Maya, because they favored gold or they used the gold in their ceremonies, that all the gold that had existed, the easy stuff, had been taken to that region and traded by the Indians. And they really didn't have much interest in mining or trying to find more because they didn't use it themselves. And so, because the Aztecs had moved from their homeland and their mining operations were no longer in existence, and because of the great upheavals and things that I believe had happened to the land that caused the Aztec to move, it took the Spanish coming back in with their, their Spanish needles, their searching, their experts in mining and exploration. It took mining individuals and people with experience in mining to be able to find the outcroppings and the deposits and the old workings and open them back up again. Of course, with more patient work and searching like the early miners did, they were able to find and open up many valuable mines. Coronado was merely looking and searching the Indian villages for already existing deposits of gold that they may have had on hand, and when he didn't find any, he went away. And so later the miners came, and that's when the real gold and the silver began to pour out of the Rocky Mountains, was after the time of Coronado.